Hello, everybody. Welcome to another What's the Score? And we had a little bit of a surprise for you, although I think they might know what it is right now. Of certainly, if you're clicking the link in the future, you're going to know what it is. But I have my little curtain behind. Um, uh, and I have Gareth, who is going to lead us through analyzing this work. So let's just not waste any time. Let's drop the curtain. Let's reveal what it is we're going to be talking about today. How about that, Gareth?
Why not?
Why not? It is going to be Jack Carr's The Terminal List. Ooh,
Yeah,
I'm
so that
very
we'll
interested.
ride a little bit of a wave of resurging popularity on this one with the
Hmm.
adaptation to a Amazon Prime series, I believe, is the new one
Yes,
that's just come
I
out
believe
off the
so.
back of because we had Jack Reacher previously, Lee Child's Killing Floor got adapted into a series there, and now we have the Terminal List. I believe this book was initially published back in 1998. So, a decent few years ago, but is obviously right back in the charts. This is what happens when you get successfully adapted to a major platform like, Netflix or Amazon or even just a movie. The book will tend to resurge in popularity. So, we're going to have a look at this one today and see what's going on between the covers.
I am very excited. You know, these things are always fun to get under the hood and just look at all the nitty gritty with AutoCrit. So let's get going.
Yeah, I think some of this today will be. I like to do these nowadays, so I'm as surprised as everybody else. So I just run all the reports, have them pre-run, but haven't really poked around to see
Ooh,
how this compares to a lot of things. So we'll
and I
do
haven't
that
seen
together
any of
today.
it. So I'm just
And
going to be
yeah,
flying blind like everybody else.
I'm not sure about the series itself because I haven't actually watched the series yet, but I've seen through reviews and everything that this seems to be a very violent thriller in terms of what the main character gets up to. It seems to be a little extreme for some people's tastes, but we'll see.
I have heard that as well.
And let's bring my screen into the stream.
All right. Woohoo! Let's
Here we
get
go.
going.
If everybody
Yes.
can see this. Now, of course, doing the kind of general reports to look through the various areas of the book within AutoCrit, I have just run it with the general fiction comparison. Now, if
Mm.
you are an AutoCrit user, you'll know that's the kind of basic bestseller setting. It covers all genres and everything. And we'll try to dial it in a little towards the end. What I have done, and I have kind of prepped here as well, is comparing to Lee Child because I think with these kind of commercial thrillers, and especially with the whole Jack Reacher series being followed up with this Terminal List series, I thought it'd be quite fun to compare to Lee Child and see how some of the stuff that's going on in this book compares to Blue Moon, which is one that we've done before from the Jack Reacher series. So one for thriller fans today. I think overall. And if anybody wants to do the customary guessing in the audience, and you're free to guess as well, Daniel, I've cleverly hidden just the overall summary score here.
Yes, you have. Now, for those of you who haven't watched a lot of these, it is a score out of 100, although the only way it could be 100 is if it exactly matched all general fiction in the world. So obviously that's not going to happen. So we're looking for a higher score, but it will vary based on the genre. Now, this being I'm guessing like a thriller pace, quite intense. Usually those do rank higher because they're breezier reads. They're a little bit more readable, as it were. So I'm gonna say 81, 82.
Yeah, so we get a lot of guesses here in the
Yeah, we've got a
80s,
few here. Let's see. We got
78.
72, 82, 87, 85, 72, 83, 78. So it's all over the map, but in the high 70s
Let's
to
get
high
specific on the
80s.
78.6. Well, it is
That'd be hilarious. Was it? Oh, look at that! Yes.
82, 80.7. Technically 83, we could let you get away with.
So Danny, you Price is Right rules. You win. No.
So we have some information here in the summary report. We'll take a quick scroll through, and obviously having a look at our fingerprint. If you're an AutoCrit user, you know the higher the number in here, that means the more indicators, quote unquote, the
Hmm.
system has found. So
A lot of
the
strong writing
where the
going
most
on
things
there.
you might need to fix are, and yeah, the generally strong writing really really running ahead here, and this would be all the reports underneath the strong writing category. So we'll have a look at that. Of course, we have repetition, word choice, pacing, and then dialogue. Dialogue
Curious
looks
what it is
fairly
in
tight.
strong writing. Generic descriptions, maybe? I don't know. Let's find out.
We have a fairly decent length of book here. This will be approximate just based on the format that I brought it in, but about 115K. Um, and then we'll look at the readability towards the end. But here, 7.1 is the grade level. We'll check the overall readability score at the end because that's
Hmm.
one that's a little surprising on this as
Short
well.
sentences. Not a surprise.
Yeah, short sentences, 14. I think we generally tend to see an average of around 12. Certainly in thrillers, it's going to be very snappy.
Yeah.
Paragraphs. We'll get to
Whoa.
pacing we'll get to pacing in a moment.
Yeah, that's surprising.
And we have our
Sorry. Oh
gauges,
wait, I'm not
power
gonna look at the
words.
power words. Not didn't
Yeah,
see that.
cover your eyes. We'll check those later. And
Whoa.
word frequency. I thought this was very, very funny. Just jumping right off the page here. So clearly, the most often used word throughout this entire manuscript is Reese, which is going to be, I assume, the name of the main character.
I
We have
certainly
some
hope so.
around here on the side, for example, occurrences. Sorry, the commander. Reese's Pieces, Commander, Team, Katie. But yeah, Reese is pretty much dominating the manuscript here. And if we look at phrase frequency, so the most used phrases, pretty much all of these are revolving around Reese doing something as well, which is really going to tie into that single word being it. It's not necessarily a bad thing at all.
No.
If the story reached just fine, but yeah, Reese had, Reese and, Reese said, Reese
Reese
was,
knew.
Reese took, Reese
Ooh,
this,
that
Reese that.
Reese knew being there makes me wonder if there's a lot of show don't tell indicators.
Could be, it could be, and I think that would fall under the strong writing category, which
I
might
think
be where
so.
it's kind of getting dinged here a bit.
Yeah.
But let's dig in and see. So I always like to start with dialogue, just because a couple of
Yep.
good reports there to focus on, and we have overall use of dialogue tags. Is the author here using said and asked more than anything else? And it's almost a kind of 50-50
Yeah, lots
level
of
pegging here.
others.
There
Interesting.
are lots of others, but it doesn't appear to be exceptionally overwrought in terms of them. You'll notice here on the charts, anything that's gray here is detected as this, by the platform as not being more than we would generally expect to see in a bestseller. So that's fairly good, except for we've got replied, responded, and stated currently just from this chart that are a little overused. And funnily enough, as we look at our sidebar here, recommendations for removals aren't gigantic.
No.
There's not a huge amount of work here to do. Just remove one, remove one, remove one. So of the reply, that's 13 overall. So 12 would kind of be the target. Responded gets a little more heavy, 5 out of 9. Of course, cautioned is technically 50% of those to shave with 1 out of 2. But looking at a lot of these, I don't think they're really terrible dialogue tags to be using. Cautioned, responded, joked, quipped. Of course, people say that's stammered, stated when people want to be frank. So yeah, it looks fairly good to me on this front. What about you, Daniel? What do you think?
I mean, from a style standpoint, it's a lot more of alternative verbs, which that's really an authorial choice. So it's interesting that they would choose to do that because a lot of those, just looking at the verbs, my editor brain, I'm like, well, do you really need to say joked or quipped? Isn't that kind of obvious in the dialogue? But it's just it's a way to button it. Put a extra little indicator on there, and some authors just don't like saying said and asked too much because they get bored. So that's a stylistic choice.
Yeah, I would think I would have uh, my editor senses would be tingling a bit more if all of these numbers were a lot larger.
Hmm.
Let's just put it that way. But I think you're right with something like joked. It's like, well, this is not in the context of the conversation that we know he's joking. I mean, surely that should just come across. So things like that can be easy to snip. But again, the author controls it.
Yep.
Looking quite good here on adverbs in
Mm.
dialogue. You'll notice the eagle eyed among you may see one thing that I'll point out in a moment. But throughout the entire manuscript, 9% of dialogue tags have an adverb connected, but very little in terms of full on overuse. And again, the numbers are low, the numbers are small. We have intentionally, and this is the one that stands out as maybe a little strange because clearly, angrily, sincerely, obviously, and incredulously are clearly fine. as an adverb you would connect to a dialogue tag, but not so much intentionally. That seems strange.
It
Certainly
does
seems
seem
strange to me,
strange.
which looked a
'Cause
little like a false positive.
how do you unintentionally tell somebody something? So I
Yeah.
wonder.
And in this case, I think if a kind of British approach, you could look at it and think, "Oh, that's just a false positive. I don't need to deal with that whatsoever." But it did actually catch something quite interesting in this manuscript, which, of course, it only pops up 3 times. But I wonder if 3 times is enough for it to be a little repetitive. Let me show you what I mean.
Hmm.
We have here this piece of dialogue. Well, Stibbs, Reese began, intentionally mispronouncing his interrogator's name. So he's intentionally saying that he's, we're being told that he's mispronouncing it intentionally.
Hmm.
This is his intent with the speech. And then the next one, again, the same thing. Hamadi, Reese said, intentionally switching to the email's first name and wrapping his hand, etc., etc. So we're told again things that he's doing with his speech
Hmm.
and mixing things up. Um, I mean, do we really need to know that he intentionally switched? Can we again contextually get that? Maybe I'm not so sure how that would work. But again, the third option, the third instance of this is much the same as well. He said, intentionally verbalizing the high value individual terminology used overseas. I think I don't know, that's a little on the nose for me.
Especially considering it's there, right? Because I'm guessing because he says the HVI, which is I maybe that's so somebody who doesn't have that knowledge would understand what HVI is, but it is kind of a weird way of saying that. It
Yeah,
does feel
it
on
comes
the
across a little
nose.
strange to me when
Yeah.
he says intentionally verbalizing the high value
Yeah.
individual terminology used overseas. I
Especially
mean,
verbalizing is a particularly weird verb
it is, because
to
if you were to
me.
say he's verbalizing it in
Was
what
it say
way? Like,
saying
is
or
he
I don't know.
stressing it, or
Yeah.
is it just the fact that he's actually saying it as
Yeah.
terminology?
But
And
just
what's the
verbalizing
information there?
versus stating or talking, I don't know, just seems overly flowery or
Yeah,
something.
it just
it, it
feels a
does
little
it does
strange.
hit my editorial like, that kind of stands out.
And if it was for the sake of sort of story wise as well, I'm wondering why this line in this way is really essential or means anything within the context of the plot or within the context of the dramatization. Because if it did, well, you wouldn't need to have that. You would simply have another character going like HVI. What does that
Mhm.
mean? And then explain it there through the characters. So it's really just
Yeah,
a.
because if
I
they
think,
don't know what he's saying, then why aren't they asking? And then why is he saying something they can't understand? So I'm a little
yeah, yeah.
confused.
So it may simply be that this kind of thing is more commonly seen in the style of military thrillers. Where there's a lot of this
Mhm.
terminology that the author, because this just reads to me like the author is putting that in there to tell you.
It
It's like, this is
does.
what we say.
Or maybe
Um,
even an editor. They're like, some people won't understand that. And then they
Potentially, yeah, yeah, it could be,
like
and that might be more common in
Sorry.
this kind of realm.
Yeah.
But overall, though, I mean, as we can clearly see here in the sidebar and everything picked up, it's very much an academic argument here. There's no obvious issues.
Well, I mean, overall, I mean, it is a bestseller and it is an 82, so we are nitpicking, but that's what editors do.
Can't help it.
No, it
Um,
is.
Moving
Yeah.
on to adverbs. So our general use of adverbs throughout this book. We can obviously see there's a lot more here in terms of numbers appearing, but in the grand scheme of things, we're in really good shape.
Yeah. Well, considering all the different verbs for speaking, it makes me think that the writer probably does go for the stronger verbs versus propping them up with adverbs, which of course is best. So.
Yeah, yeah. I reckon it's probably fairly heavy on that approach, and just some of the overused things we do have here. Quickly, probably, slowly, immediately, exactly. You can see them all listed there. We'll check them in the sidebar as well.
I mean,
Surprising
quickly
amount of
might just be a
removals.
result of it being a story where people do quicker things than normal.
Yeah, I think a lot of it would be hard to stay away from words like that as well, with kind of high octane action
Mhm.
going on all the time. So you have swiftly here as well. Instantly would be one too. Fast
Mhm.
reactions and all that kind of thing. So yeah, it's as we get lower in the list, obviously there are versions with less to be removed meticulously. Is a good one. So yeah, it seems like there's a lot of work to bring that one into being exactly, well, I guess perfect, if you wanted to say that. But obviously, you can see here the whole this kind of rule of like, don't ever use adverbs; they're not welcome anywhere. Is not true. They have use, they have utility, and clearly you can get away with a decent number of them.
Yes. Filler.
Filler. Yes, we love filler words, and not too many going on in this one. Funnily enough, this was where the result feels like a big gain for little work, because you can see here we don't have a massive list of removal recommendations. We got about 13 of that's and about 6 of just. Um, I'm always shocked or surprised when I see that the just that form of that is not overused. It generally is overused alongside that's, but this one got away with it just fine. However, our overall gauge, as we're looking, is just a little over
Mhm.
average use,
Yeah.
which is why I'm saying here I think a little work would really bring that right up.
I would I would still look at that probably because in this specific case, because even though it's not saying to remove any, it's like right in the average, and there are a lot of them.
It could
Obviously,
be,
it's a
yeah.
long work, but it might be worth looking into
Yeah, that's true. And a lot of the things with that is a tough one. Now, just I think we all know
that.
can a lot of those can tend to go. But I
Hmm.
had a feeling looking at 52 of that's, and of course a lot of that, even though it is average, with about 13 removals, that was going to be dialogue. And as you hop through here, certainly. So yes, that's right.
Hmm.
As he's talking to him,
I
that's
mean, this
neat.
is a good point that's coming up in the dialogue for that's as well. Adverbs, yeah, probably a lot of those adverbs were in the dialogue, and people
Most
do,
likely.
yeah. So that is something you have to keep in mind, especially if you have a dialogue heavy work. You may want to compare yourself to somebody else who's a dialogue heavy writer, just for those indications, depending, or just keep it in mind while you're
Yeah, one thing is to do be aware of that in your own work as well. For example, if you were to load up in general fiction and find that you're really getting smacked around for dialogue tags, for example,
hmm
think about whether your book is heavy on dialogue. Maybe it
right.
is. In which case, you're going to get uh, dinged for that anyway. There's not much you can do without stripping out all the dialogue tags, and you don't want to do that because then half of it won't be able to readers won't be able to follow it. So by the very nature of having more dialogue, you're gonna have to give yourself a bit of leeway and not try to get rid of all the red, because that's just not going to work creatively. But here, yes, that's why I'm questioning it. That's war, Reese. And that's the whole point of having one. See, these are all, I'm sure there's probably going to be a few that could maybe be massaged, but if I was the author looking through here, I don't think I would be too concerned with that result. I would likely leave that's the way it is. They certainly seem to be showing up. Um, entirely in dialogue so far. I don't think I've seen a single one that hasn't been in dialogue yet. And we're about halfway through the book. And before I go any further and spoil things for people, I'll scroll back.
And that could still be an overuse because even if it's natural, you don't necessarily want it to be too repetitive. So it might still be worth looking at. Is that the way the character needs to speak over and over again or not? You can look into it. But obviously it does make a difference. People do use a fair amount of filler language when they're talking. So
Yeah, I would think as you're going down through the manuscript, kind of like we were seeing there, each click had a fairly decent jump, until it got to the next
hmm
that's within dialogue. But of course, if you had a whole section where somebody's saying that's it, and then the other person responds that's right, and he's like that's not quite right, and that's as they're back and forth. Yeah, you're probably going to
hmm
want to do a bit of work on that.
yeah.
And our pacing.
That
So
is so
an interesting
surprising to
one.
me in this genre, that especially that you start with two slower paragraphs. Fascinating.
I think there's a lot of this
Oh,
really
three.
slow, yeah, this whole
More, whoa,
beginning
more.
section. And
Wow.
I think
It's
technically
like
in the story, if I'm right, this is a prologue. It is indeed. So part of the reason people generally don't like prologues as well, when it comes to editors and agents, they'll tend to look at the prologue and think it's too slow. We're not starting fast enough. And all the prologue is doing is bogging down your opening. And that is, I think, quite evident here in terms of the pacing, not necessarily in terms of the content. Don't get me wrong there, because I think people who are into this kind of thing are probably going to read this. It looks like there's a lot of detail in here. I mean, look at
hmm
this. The rifle was chambered in 300 Winchester Magnum,
Yeah.
despite wearing far less than the sniper rifles he'd used overseas. Then we get to hear a Night Force NXS 2.5,
Yeah,
all
which
these details.
that's the sort of thing too, though. It's funny because people will get confused because they'll read something like this and they'll be like, "Oh, audiences love that," and then they'll write like a romance novel and it'll be like, "The room was 20 feet by 30 feet," and that's not what people who read that genre are looking for. So you
Yeah.
have to be really careful about that.
Yes, it's not going to transfer with that level of detail. But this is almost like I think for this kind of military esque thing,
Hmm.
um, you could refer to it as kind of nerdery. This, the
It
author is
is
getting into that because people
absolutely.
who read it love that stuff. They love
Yeah,
the
it's
detail.
like hard sci-fi will do that, and it'll get into scientific
Hmm.
concepts, and it'll go along into biology and stuff. And the people who read it are loving, that kind of level of detail being thrown into a narrative and playing around with it. And then for people who aren't interested in it, they're like, whatever, maybe they'll skim through it or something. But that really hits the sweet spot for certain people reading that genre. So you have to keep that in mind.
And I think it's likely part of the getting when we get to the strong writing category. I'm going to assume that this opening, this prologue, with all this detail and it's
It's
essentially
kind of a good
summarizing
point.
as well. It's going to be a heavy spot, I think, to get hit for showing versus telling. That whole thing because it's not. It is very summarized, but it's packing in a lot of detail about where he is and what's going on. And let me just see what happens when we get to the first chapter. Technically, so we have the ambush chapter 1. So that's our prologue, fairly slow, and then chapter 1 seems to get into it a lot more, a lot faster. There's occasional pauses here, but these look like fairly well spaced pieces of slowing down. There's a lot of measure going on there, and then yeah, we're just off to the races with the rest. So this is probably like an opening action sequence, I think, for chapter 1, and hopefully people don't get too overwhelmed or bored in the prologue. And looking at
But
this, we premise.
I agree though the comment that it almost too is when you're talking about military fiction, one thing you're trying to do is alert to the audience that you know what you're talking about, right?
Oh
Um,
yeah.
Particularly because my assumption is the way that this is going to go is there's a certain amount of realism in the action that is different than a typical thriller type genre where a lot of the people maybe don't even handle weaponry all that often. Whereas this, when you have all that kind of detail, my assumption is some of those things are going to matter in the plot, like weight and range and all of those things in a way. And the author wants to let you know that they know what they're talking about.
Yeah, it's building something authentic. I think there is within this kind of subgenre of the military action thriller that uh, suspension of disbelief is not as much of a thing.
Hmm.
They have to be as authentic as possible, at least try to be, because a lot of the people reading it are going to be current or ex-military, and it's like, well, that's not right. you know, you can't pull the wool over my eyes with that silly set piece. That simply wouldn't work in real life. So yeah, you do need the time to get those details in, and I think, like you said there with the comment, is kind of earning your stripes early, setting the expectation that you do know what you're talking about. So yes, I'm going to read this book. I'll stick it with this one. So yeah, good point. But we have in this particular book, yeah, across the whole thing, 18.95%. So we're getting up to 25% of paragraphs that feel a little slow, and that's surprising to me with an action thriller, especially something that seems to be as centered around violent set pieces.
Hmm.
As this one, I'm led to believe this one is. Don't get me wrong, I haven't read the entire thing, nor watched the series, but I'll definitely check it out. But we can see here a lot of, there's certainly breaks here where things are just pushing forward, but then a nice chunk here that seems fairly slow. That may be an act transition. Not so sure. Certainly towards the end here, we're slowing down a lot in this chunk. But one thing that I wanted to do, like I said earlier, I took a look at the nearest kind of cousin, I guess, to something like this that we had, which was Jack Reacher's Blue Moon, and see what type of thing we have there. So over on our blog, we actually have a What's the Score blog post
Mm,
on Blue Moon, and I thought, let's check out the pacing. So here we
sure.
have Lee Child's Blue Moon, and we can skip to Pacing and Momentum, and that book's only 6.19%. Seems to move along at a much faster clip.
Yeah. Wow.
No pun intended with clip.
I mean, you have like where you would expect that kind of big climax or ratcheting up tension there, like two-thirds in, but that would be to that would be expected. That escalation right around there.
Yeah, and it may be a bit of an unfair comparison as well if you're out there and you're a fan of both. It's like, well, Blue Moon is the sixth or seventh book in the series, and this one is the first in the terminal list is part one or volume one of a series. It's obviously going to be slower as it's introducing the characters and setting up the world and all of that. Which follow up books like with Lee Child, nowadays people can pick up a Jack Reacher and be off to the races because they're
Mhm.
into the series and they know it. So there may be an element of that that works into the pacing as well. I just find it quite interesting how different they were. Let's get to some word choice here with generic descriptions. Let's see how we're doing. So 664 general markers found, a little above average, but again, that is not a bad thing, not terrible. And our most generic ones here it looked like a big thing, large. It looked like a large thing. We have special, serious, main, and tough. And I'm thinking tough is probably going to be either referring to tough guys or tough armor or something like that. Now, I would also assume. Well, let's have a look. So it's not so much of an assumption. With the word special, I'm probably guess it's going to be references to special forces.
Operation.
Here we have special operations soldier,
Yeah. So that's
special
obviously
operations
just the
force.
specific use for this specific work, which most books don't have special operations forces or special agents, and so that's why this word special. It's not
Yeah,
being used as a typical special. Probably it's not being used very much at all, like actual special, because the author doesn't want to confuse you with a special agent or a special officer by saying, it was his special hat or something, right?
you're like, okay, yeah, is that part of his job to do that, or just how he
Yeah,
feels about it?
exactly, right? Yeah.
So yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it's something like this again, comparing genre-wise to general fiction here. 59 counts of special being used and removed by 47. This is a vast majority of those asked to remove that because not many books or not most books out there anyway are always talking about special agents and special forces and characters introducing themselves as special agent Robert Bridger. It's not a thing that's all over. That's really well, I guess popular or I'm trying to find the word from my brain, prevalent across all genres. It's very tight to the thriller. So in this case, if you were doing general fiction and going through here and realizing that, okay, I'm using the word special a lot, but it's always got to do with special agents and special forces and special access programs, like we can see here, you're probably okay. Don't let that put you off. You can ignore, just take that out, ignore that word. Of course, I think I would always recommend that you check from start to finish just in case. There are a few things that you're saying, sort of like he felt special in that moment. So it doesn't really tell me a whole lot. That can be very fluffy and generic. But if you check through start to finish, and it's like, yeah, you're just referencing special operations. And again, not repeating it all the time. I have a little bit of a worry if these three paragraphs had special, 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 special. The repetition side of things would be a worry. But if that's not the case and you're jumping through and it's all contextual, well, in that case, I would untick it. Don't let it bother you. Initial pronouns and names. I always like to check this one just as a kind of general barometer of what people are doing. And this book, 50.76%. So this is of sentences throughout the entire novel. 50% of them roughly are starting with a character name or a pronoun. In this book, I did notice when I glanced through it earlier that we had a couple of false positives that it grabbed just because of some strange sentence constructions, but it's not too many. I think the overall reading on this one would probably be about 48 or 49%, with
Mhm.
any false positives removed, which is on the high end. We don't generally tend to see too many books hitting 50 or kind of going above 50. Usually somewhere between 30, 35 to 50 is our realm here. So we're definitely pushing up against that. And I
Mhm.
wonder, I didn't look, but we can check here and see if we have that for Blue Moon.
Yeah, I mean, we did notice in that word cloud that we had that character name and a lot. Like it was so pronounced. that it was almost the entire word cloud in of itself. So,
Yeah, I think it's going to push it up a lot.
yeah.
So much mention of Reese. Well, here we have Blue Moon. That was 41.65 overall. So a decent chunk fewer than we see here. Alongside the Blue Moon initial pronouns and names, we did also have sentence starters, which we have here, which will be these ing verbs
Hmm.
and conjunctions. 6.95%. I think that was very, very close. Yeah,
Yeah.
6.72. They compare very favorably
Yeah.
when it comes to this kind of rule. And I think keeping this to a minimum throughout really any work, this is something editorially that I always keep an eye out for, is starting these sentences with especially continuous verbs, ing verbs, jumping out of the car, he opened the door, something like that. It just sentences become really confused. It doesn't make sense. Clauses get broken left and right, and it can be really, really janky. So that's something that I highly recommend doing, is keeping that to a minimum. Rephrase the sentences if you come back on a first draft and find that you've done that quite a lot. The majority of them, I would say, rework in some way.
Let's move on to phrases. I'm guessing you're getting
Repetition.
a lot of Reese did this and Reese did that.
We had fairly high numbers on the repetition scale, so I wanted to take a look at a bit of repetition on this one. Now, repetition as a report and as a section here in AutoCrit, I think everybody here who uses it regularly will know it's work. It's a bit of a mission, kind of going through
Hmm.
and cutting down all the instances of repetition that you can find. But phrase frequency is really useful for that, because you can find 2 words, 3 words, 4 word phrases that you have used repeatedly throughout. And I'd like to just jump right to the longest ones, because usually the longest ones will contain the shortest ones as kind of part of them.
Uh-huh.
And the longer it is, the more it stands out. So I like to keep a look at those. And we have here 9 instances throughout the book of out of the ordinary. So if we check what's going on there, and we start to
This was the question. If you don't use sentence starters, don't all sentences begin with a noun or a pronoun? No,
no.
because it's not any noun, right? When it says that's not the 50%, is it? Is it any noun? I thought it was.
Of nouns. No, nouns are fine. No,
Yeah,
it's
it's not nouns, it's pronouns
with sentence
and
starters, just pronouns like he,
proper
she,
nouns,
I,
right?
we, etc., and character names.
Yeah.
So things like to combat. Well, that's a separate thing, because that's the pronoun side. Then you have the sentence starter side with the verbs, and the sentence starter side with the verbs is, in terms of the report, is both verbs and um, conjunctions. Using
Mhm.
but, and, etc. to start a sentence. I don't really have anything wrong or any hatred towards conjunctions starting a sentence. Like, sorry, old school editors and grammar fans, but I think starting a sentence with a conjunction is fine. Just don't do it too much. It helps for rhythm with fragments.
Mhm.
However, let's say instead of starting with the technique I always recommend, or the tip I always recommend to authors who kind of fall into the rut of using a continuous verb at the start of sentences all the time, and getting into a bit of a mess because of that, is rather than starting with that verb because you're indicating a character's kind of doing something, start with the detail that's
Mhm.
important instead. So instead of a sentence where you say a character sits down at their desk and then looking out the window to the moon, they this or that, is just draw attention to the first detail. So instead of saying looking out the window, just say moonlight spilled through the window. Draw attention to the detail of the moonlight, the thing that they're looking at instead. As we are inhabiting a POV character, we tend to follow that quite easily. So you don't have to say that they looked at they're looking at a glass on the table. Describe the glass. We know they're looking at it. Because we're following them throughout the action of the sequence. So hopefully that makes sense. That's just the first thing I always say is, if you're starting a sentence with that, just find a detail that you can paint instead, and trust the reader to follow it. Usually we can. But this, when we have our repetition out of the ordinary, we have some dialogue here, quite a block there. But as far as these two guys being together, nothing out of the ordinary. And
Mhm.
then they seem to talk a little bit about that. No, but that wouldn't be out of the ordinary with this crew. Um, yeah, okay. And I wonder if the character uses that phrase quite often if it is from the same character. From Reese. Here we have some narrative prose. Again, this is going to be in his POV. So if out of the ordinary is something that he mentions a lot, that can be fine, as long as it's not just too close to one another. With the phrase frequency here, it's picking up throughout the entire manuscript. This isn't looking
Mhm.
specifically in proximity. We're looking everywhere. Nothing out of the ordinary. There's some pretty nasty stuff on the floor, evidently.
Thanks for the idea. We might very well do a live stream on starting sentences. Sounds fun.
Nothing appeared out of the ordinary. Yeah, I think this is one of Reese's kind of personal little phrases here, and it's not popping up too close to one another for my liking, so that's good. And what appeared to be every police, etc. What appeared to be a strange-looking chicken. Excellent. What appeared to be the very incarnation of pure rage. So these things, yep, this is fun, and like I said, popping through on this one, I'm not seeing it showing up a little too close to one another. It's not standing out too much for me, but it could be something that would annoy you. Keep your own hat on as an author and think about it.
Mhm.
If you were to see, would you, between the previous one and this one, have kind of forgotten that you're seeing what appeared to be things over and over
Mhm.
again? If that's a phrase that would stand out to you, you're going to want to do this to nix it. I don't think I would be
Mhm.
too annoyed by that, but
Mhm.
obviously others may be. And look for
Usually with
really.
things like this, it's the more unusual phrases that tend to stick out. Something that, I mean, some of the ones like out of the ordinary or something might kind of just because you're seeing it a fair amount, but obviously nine in like a whole long book, probably not. But something that's a really unusual phrase nine times in a book, you might very well notice because it's such an unusual way of phrasing something that
Mhm.
you're going to note it's going to. So, really, most of these seem like a repetition of fairly, normal sounding things like they said, shaking their head, that's probably the fact that that happened four times in a whole long book. It's probably not going to stand out all that much.
Yeah, this one is generally always a concern to me. There are two things that tend to concern me with repetition if I see phrases like this. One is called bobblehead syndrome, where people just are shaking their heads all the time, and the other is the wide-eyed. I just call it the
Hmm.
wide-eyed, and that's people's eyes going wide or their eyes narrowing to slits.
Hmm.
As just lots of eye action going on. Is
Hmm.
don't get too enamored with either of them, because yeah, you can walk yourself right into a bobblehead scenario, or just an eye fest. And this one, I think, four across the whole novel is probably not terrible. But again, if it connects to a single character too, that can be a little better, because it's kind of their little perk thing. Is like they shake their head.
Yeah.
But Ben said they're shaking his head. Reese said shaking his head. Okay, fine. So we have two characters. Not yeah. There's only four in the book. I don't think that's someone else shaking their head. No, I think that's fine. But it's something you would definitely want to take a look. Keep an eye out for, because if that was 11, for example,
Hmm.
you're going to start getting a little annoyed at how much that keeps happening. So yeah, I think like Daniel said, is look for things like that, and also look for things that are just particularly unusual, um, being used over and over again. Um, so both, I guess, too similar and too unusual. I've told this story before, but I have had a few breakthroughs with my own work, especially thanks to this report. Noticing in one that people were falling to their knees, and I never even realized that until I saw that the phrase "fell to his knees" was there up like five times. I was like, well, how is this? And looking through where that happened each time, it turned out that the whole story was happening in a cyclical series of action sequences that all played out almost entirely the same. With the character falling to his knees and then recovering. And I had to mix that up. It was just too bland, the same thing over and over again. And it can really help you find and unlock those kind of, little scenarios and extra bits of promise, I think, in your work. But looking at the phrases here, I'm not seeing anything that's leaping out at me as particularly um, egregious. I know we'll have things like here, Balboa Naval Medical Center, the Naval Special Warfare, the Secretary of Defense. It's a military thriller. These things are going to be repeated.
Hmm. Exactly. Yeah. I'm not seeing a lot in there that seems particularly like it stands out as a concern.
And speaking of military thrillers, if we get to the readability, we got flash reading ease here, and again, if you're historically a fan who's joined us for a lot of these lists of the scores, you'll know that certainly over the past few books that we've looked at, the general modern commercial readability area tends to be around 80. The higher you go in flesh reading ease, the more quote unquote accessible, easy to read the text is. And that's a combination of various things like short sentences, simple words that obviously aren't complicated. And complicated can mean many things, but generally, I think above 3 syllables tends to become more referred to as a complicated or difficult word. So keeping those to a minimum, and the more you do that, the snappier the writing is, the easier it becomes to digest, and that pushes the score up. And we tend to see most, like I said, coming in today around 80, certainly high 70s. So this one, 71. That's almost an entire grade step. I don't want to say down because it's technically a grade up. It means the reader needs to be a bit more proficient in reading, a little older and more experienced to properly track this one.
Hmm.
Um, Now, I don't think that's necessarily a negative, and I think
Nope.
for this subgenre is probably entirely unavoidable
Yeah, it's
because of
probably
all the
fairly
terminology.
normal of all the terminology, and then those slower paragraphs that go into that technical detail.
Yeah, yeah. I think the slower opening here would obviously drag it down a little, as we know, this big paragraphs that have technical terminology,
Hmm.
unusual stuff packed right in the middle of them.
Yeah.
But that's the experience of this. I would probably be worried in general if we were like way below 70, we like at 50 or something. You're starting to read like a technical textbook that
Hmm.
is just full of jargon, but it's certainly not doing that. So I don't think. With the terminal list, we have any problem when it comes to accessibility and being able to actually follow the action and understand what's going on. It's just a side effect of military terminology, which, like we know, has to be there. It's what the audience wants.
Yep. Absolutely. To some degree too, they might want something that reads older because it could. I know a lot of this, not to get too broad in my assumptions, but I know for a lot of this it is an older audience that tend to read it. It's not generally, young adults. It's often retirees, to be frank, and so they might actually be looking for something that reads older, feels a little more
I thought you were
complicated.
going to say we want to front load it with a bit more difficult to read stuff so it puts off the young ones before they get to the violence.
Mhm. I mean, to some degree, that too, right? It kind of makes it feel more mature in general. Yeah.
Speaking of violence, here we
Ooh.
have power words. So we're going to look at
Oh.
how power words are working,
I'm
breaking this
guessing a
one down.
lot of fear and yep.
Yes, I was very surprised to see fear being so large in this one.
Yeah.
Generally, that's the realm of horror. We tend to see horror leading sorry, fear leading the way in a horror story, which makes me kind of interested in, in this one, as our main kind of connectors here are fear. We also have encouragement at quite a high number compared to the fear, so it's kind of coming up second, but almost level pegging with greed. Encouragement and greed. So encouragement is usually that sense of adventure, the sense of
Yeah.
momentum going through. So we
That
definitely
is a
have
lot of greed.
a very strong, because with fear and greed that high, connected to the encouragement, and anger and lust kind of creeping up almost the same behind. It speaks to me of probably a very adult thriller
Hmm.
with a lot of nasty stuff likely happening.
Hmm.
Which, of course, if anybody here has read it, you can say if I'm correct in that assumption.
Probably, probably quite cynical if you think about
Likely, yeah, yeah,
if you think about those greed words, because I'm guessing that the prompts for greed isn't so much a direct money, because greed, it doesn't just relate to money, it just relates to that, that passion for taking things. So I would say, and your rank in society, those sort of words. So
yeah,
my guess is that's a lot of the motivation beyond encouragement, which tends to be more like self development sort of stuff. So this is, not surprisingly enough, probably not some sort of feel good story about somebody finding themselves through, but more about trying to regain power.
yeah. Very unlikely to be a very positive, heartwarming work. But yeah, you're quite right in terms of the greed and lust as well. Lust kind of
Hmm.
goes up comes up behind that with lust isn't just about sex and carnal desire. It's about lust for power,
Hmm.
lust for vengeance,
Yeah.
all these things, and I believe. just knowing the synopsis of this story, that I think that fits fairly well. Just yeah, surprised to see so much fear and anger bolstering up behind it.
So he's asking if you have a thief in the story, is greed okay? I would imagine you would get a lot of that. Now, the thing
Oh
about the
yeah,
power words is that sometimes it's kind of on the nose like that, like you would expect in a romance, you might have more lust, or in a horror, you might have more fear. However, it has to do with that emotional response, right? So you could have a story about a thief that actually greed is not very high because it's actually more of a story of redemption, and so it might have more encouragement and safety or something, like. So don't over concern yourself with it having to be on the nose. It really is more about the emotional underpinnings of those words, is what
correct.
I'm getting at.
Yeah, a lot of what this is breaking down is more a tonal observation of the story, rather than specific content. Which again is why I was surprised with so much fear. In a thriller, especially a commercial thriller like that, it doesn't seem to be like tonally that it's supposed to be upsetting you in a way. And this one maybe. So it's quite interesting.
Hmm.
And what did we do here?
Mystery and suspense, it looks like.
Yeah, so I tried a couple of comparisons here, and I thought, well, at the moment we have mystery and suspense, which a lot of thrillers kind of gear towards now. However, I am encouraging, we're working behind the scenes to build an actual this kind of thriller, because of course mystery, suspense, they break down in different ways,
Hmm.
and a military thriller is a very defined thing, as we've seen going through this one today with, for
Yeah,
example, terminology and uses of words like special. Military thrillers are their own thing, and we may work towards introducing that as a whole other area. So keep an eye out for that. We'll talk about it.
that would be
um,
cool.
so we did compare initially to mystery and suspense to see how our score changed, and what do we have here in the original?
The original was 82.76. So what do we think? Do we think that it is more similar to mystery and suspense than general fiction? Do you think it's less similar? It's actually going to go down? Do we think it's going to go up a lot? Well, I don't know. You can put your guesses
It's
in the
like, is
chat.
there more suspenseful language? What was the game show with the cards, higher or lower?
Yeah, card sharks? Yeah. That's kind of old school. Um, I'm trying to think. Well, I think Price is Right did that too. I think it will probably move up, but not much. My guess is that it's pretty much where it's at. So maybe up to like 83. That's my
Likely
guess.
true, I think. I think likely to struggle a little with the specific terminology. Mystery and
89. So let's
suspense.
see. Whoa, it jumped up a lot more than I thought.
Yep, 85.
85.
So
Ooh,
just about
Danny
hit.
got it right. I'm pretty sure he typed that before we put it up. So there you go. Danny is on point. That's the second one in a row.
And I just gave it away there as well. But I did a further comparison to Lee Child, because, of course, I've been talking and thinking, okay, well, this kind of thriller
Yeah.
about a military man going kind of off the rails,
Yeah.
and how does this compare to Lee Child's profile? So we can
Let's see.
look there
Went down
too.
slightly, but still more than general.
So
Interesting.
84.24.
Yeah.
It's a definite increase on the baseline. So it seems to be inching towards that kind of audience. It's the same
Yeah.
sort of people. There's a definite positive signal there that it's along the same lines, working
Yeah.
towards what people who like Jack Reacher novels would probably be a little more interested in than,
Feel
than your
free,
general person.
Tammy, to shoot out your question. Go ahead. Yeah, I thought it would move up, but I was surprised at how much it moved up. That was a lot more. That's fascinating. It is more of a example of the genre than I might have originally expected.
Yeah, it's sometimes strange and quite unpredictable as well, because a lot of the time you'll see novels. So, for example, it could be here on 82.76, and you compare, and it changes maybe to 83.1. A very, very small shift. But it's always a good sign of, as long as the shift is kind of positive, that you've got a strong work. It's not jumping around wildly and being totally inaccessible to different people. That's tends to be crazy. It's like something's really fundamentally wrong with the writing, if that were ever to be the case. So yeah, I think oh well, 2.5 point sort of jump there is notable.
Hmm. Go ahead, Tammy, if you have that question. Daniel asked. He said that his writing tends to be around grade 4 level. Should they try to increase it, and how? That's very subjective, right? Because that could be fine. It could be that perhaps you have turned on your editor brain maybe a bit too much. You're making your it sounds silly, but you're making your book almost too readable, like it's a little bit too simple to read, perhaps. But I mean, there are great works. I'm not sure, like, I'm just for example, like Ernest Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea. I'm not sure what grade level that would be considered by that those sort of metrics. It might be quite low because of the simplicity of the sentence structure, and obviously that book is very well regarded. So it just depends on what you're looking for. But it is possible that you have clued in on something that maybe you are stripping it back a little bit too much, and you might try a bit more. I don't want to say exciting, but more, some different playing with your sentence structure a little bit. What do you think, Gareth?
Yeah, see what works. I think ultimately, at the end of the day, it falls down to your audience. Do people
Yeah.
like it? Do they understand it? Do they get it? Do they enjoy it? That's all that matters. And I mean, a fourth grade level, I'm not so up in my American grades, but I think that's very young. Um, the Flesh
Hmm.
Kincaid, I believe, when you get up in that readability scale to the 90 to 100, I think is fifth grade is like
Hmm.
the kind of lowest, quote unquote, that goes in terms of age. So fourth grade seems it does sound quite simplistic, but again, the same things like does it serve you well?
Right.
Uh, that's really it.
Yeah, and sometimes those things are not they're not exact science. Those algorithms, they can be often triggering on a lot of things like just your sentence structure. So it could just be you write very short sentences, you don't vary the sentence structure very much. It's a lot of active sentences, so it's just very clear. That could be good, but it could be that, yeah, maybe it's a little sing-songy, maybe it's a little juvenile. It just depends.
Yeah, so I mean, you don't want it being so simplistic. Like Daniel said, if things aren't varying and sentences all seem to be the same length and all the same rhythm, you get the lullaby effect, where as you're reading something like that, you start to zone out because the rhythm seems to lull you away and your
Hmm.
brain just disappears. Well, mine does anyway, down some
Yeah.
rabbit hole that, and then I refocus my eyes and I'm three quarters of the way down the page and go, I wasn't even reading that.
Yeah.
I've got to go back and do it again, and that's why a little bit of a shock, a little bit of something extra to mix it up keeps
Yeah.
people involved. But not saying that's necessarily the case with yours, Daniel.
Yeah.
If it works for
Exactly.
you, you know the people you cater to like it,
Yeah.
stick with it.
Yeah. And Anne said that she's finally got brave enough to edit her short story challenge piece that she paid for a critique on. She got it through us, and she said it was insightful, and she's trying to follow our advice. Well, I appreciate that, Anne, for the shout out. And yeah, it's hard as an author when you get uh, criticism, and even though we try to be as encouraging as we can, and truthful, like we don't want to mislead you, but we don't want to discourage you, but it can be hard taking that into consideration and then figuring out how to move forward. So good for you. It's part of the process, and you will be better for it. So
Yeah, I think good luck with the edits and the changes. I think if the feedback makes sense to you and it feels right, then at least you've got some direction. It's just now a fun time of figuring out how to do it.
right, that's the fun part, especially because we often don't really like to box our writers up. We don't try to be like, and you must change it to this. We just generally speak to problems. So usually you get the problems, and then you have to come up with the solutions because we want you to actually write your own book. So you get to decide what you do with that. So that could be fun. Although sometimes too, to be perfectly honest, it's not like when I get something, I even always have the answers because I didn't write the thing, so I won't think of all the possibilities that you might have had in your brain. So rather than say, well, you should do it this way, it's often, have you thought about the fact that this isn't really working? And then, I often am really surprised with what the writers will come back with, because they'll come back with a really cool idea that I was prompting them to get to, which is awesome, but was way cooler than what I might have thought as a solution. So it's perfect all around. Oh no, she said, Catherine suggested you have my critique ready, but it's not yet. Should you be nervous? No, it's not a sign that there's something so severely wrong that they're worried about how to put it to you or something like that. It probably just means there was some sort of timing situation. I know we can't control how people give us the works, so we can end up with a bit of a backlog because a lot of writers just submit all at the same time. So that might have been what happened. But don't worry, I'm sure it is not a reflection on the quality of your work one way or the other. We're used to dealing with all levels of writing, so it's not like a work that is maybe needs a little more criticism or comments is going to hold us up. So
And we can mention it to her as well, Paige. I'll
yeah,
make a note here and check with Catherine because maybe she has sent it over and it just disappeared into spam or something like that. That happens
that's true.
occasionally, so
That
I'll,
happens
I'll
too.
get her to reach out to you.
Just in case. All right, so Gareth, do we have some interesting things coming on our stream? I'm pretty sure we do. In fact, I'm pretty sure for those of you who are enjoying all of this, looking at the reports, we're going to be talking more about editing next week. Tips for you to do with your own work, right?
We will be. Next week is I'm trying to find remember dates for myself. Is the 19th.
Yeah,
That's 7 days from now.
I know we're talking about different editing things, and I'm trying to remember the exact order. So,
Yes, next week. What's up with adverbs?
ooh,
Is
what is
our
up with
title for next week.
adverbs?
Yeah, what is up with adverbs? I don't know. I guess we'll find out next Tuesday. But I guess a part of that will be part of what we saw today, looking at the adverbs report for the even the terminal list is there's a lot in there, but it's not the end of the world. It doesn't
No,
necessarily need to be. So we'll
it
dig a
does
bit more
not.
into adverbs, their utility,
Um,
what to watch out for
yeah.
specifically, and maybe dispel a few myths at the same time.
Yeah, even Stephen King uses them, just saying. Hypocrite. I'm kidding. But yes, we will discuss adverbs quickly, succinctly, and very elegantly next week. I'm looking forward to that. And looking forward to more sessions here on this live stream about editing. So if you haven't, please like, subscribe, hit the bell, do all that stuff. Tell your friends. I appreciated the suggestion about sentence starters. We'll have to get to that sometime. And if you have any suggestions about these live streams, yeah, let us know anytime. We're always looking for what you want to learn about as writers. But in the meantime, join us in the AutoCrit community. If you're there, there's events coming up there, exclusive events, and we'll see you around. All right. Thanks, Gareth, for this
Yes,
discussion. Really cool.
you're welcome. Thank you very much, everybody. I hope you had fun and
I
saw
did.
at least a couple of little surprises.
There were, definitely. All right. See you next week, everybody.
Bye bye.